So you recall a few weeks ago we had Peter, Lyndon James from Shalom House. He came with some of his fellas. We all remember that. So he and the boys gave testimony to the power of God in their lives when they told their stories and gave other stories from God's rescue of drug addiction and general sinful lives and things. And then at the men's breakfast the next morning, us blokes who were able to go there got to hear a more detailed version of his testimony. And it's just an amazing witness to the power and love of God. So partly why I'm saying that is to advertise the fact that I've put it up on our YouTube channel. So a few people seem to have found their way to watch that. And so especially the ladies who weren't able to be there. So if you want to have a listen to what he said, it was just really powerful. The audio's okay, but we get by on that. It's quite audible. So I encourage you to have a listen to that. But I realise many of you aren't into doing YouTube and that kind of thing. So I'm going to do the next best thing now for a testimony of other people's testimony. I'm going to give this story about God changing someone's life. This is their story. This is someone called VLM. A little over 18 years ago, I was at a point in my life that is reflected in the old song, "Is That All There Is?" Does anyone know that song? I don't know that song. Is that all there is? No. I was in my late 20s, married with a young son, but something was missing. My husband and I were unfortunately into the modern free thinking and pornography. We had a couple who were close friends over and had a few too many to drink. Looking to see what was missing, we started down the wrong path. But even then, God had his hand on me, just as he protected Sarah when passed off as Abraham's sister. I got sick and woke up halfway around our block. I woke up also to the fact that was not what was missing in my life. The Lord then sent us to a marriage encounter weekend, and we knew that God was missing. But there was no one there to tell us how to find him. The Lord then sent my cousins on vacation to visit us, and they gave us the gospel. Both my husband and I received him at that time. We've never even looked back. We both serve the Lord in our home and church. We've been through the furnace. Isaiah 48 verse 10. Behold, I have refined you, but not as silver. I've tested you in the furnace of affliction. We can only give all praise and glory to the Lord God Almighty, and the Lord God Almighty is in capitals. So that's one person's testimony, a very brief version. Now I know Peter can tell you many similar stories, Peter, Lyndon James, of people moving from bondage to sin into freedom in Christ. And in fact, did you hear on the Australian Story episode that was about Peter, Lyndon James and Shalom House? It was on a few weeks ago. There was a guy who saw that over in, I think it's from Melbourne. He just jumped on a plane and flew over and just lobbed up at the door and said, "Help me." So, the power of the media for good sometimes, occasionally. So that's the kind of thing that is, to me, is the great evidence of the Spirit of God at work. And God's greatest work is not in tongues or supposed supernatural signs and stuff like that. God's greatest work is the real eternal heart change of real lost and suffering people. Only God can do that, and we thank him that he does. So, like I said, today we're back in the book of Luke. And we're going to look at these two specific healings that Jesus performs and what we can learn from them. There's a lot. Like the changes that God's done through the Shalom guys, the physical healings are not in isolation. Both of these healings that we read about just before are connected with a deeper spiritual healing, and that's the most important thing. And I was blown away this week at the things that God teaches us through these events, these particular events. So what I'll do this morning is sort of go through the basics of how Jesus heals both the leper and the paralytic. Not the how, not the molecular level, I have no idea. But sort of when it came about. And then we'll step back a bit and see what we can learn from an overview of those two things as we hold these two events together. So I hope that gets you thinking a little bit. So starting at verse 12. While he was in one of the cities, there came a man full of leprosy. And when he saw Jesus, he fell on his face and begged him, "Lord, if you will, you can make me clean." And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, "I will, be clean." and immediately the leprosy left him. Now, to really appreciate the meaning of this healing, we need to appreciate what it means to have leprosy in that time, in that place in Galilee. Firstly, it may not have been leprosy by the official diagnosis we have today. The word was used to describe all kinds of skin diseases, really, but this was clearly one of the most horrible kinds. And without going into the detail of what it's all about, I'll just talk a little bit about what Leviticus 13 tells you about how it's viewed by the Jews, certainly in those days. So Leviticus 13 tells us lots. It says this kind of leprosy is more than skin deep. So in verse 3, he talks about it being, if it's more than skin deep, so it goes deep inside you, but beyond just on the surface. It's very contagious. That's sort of implied in sort of the whole chapter, really, but in verse 8 as well. So the whole, how it can pass on very easily. It defiles, so it makes you unclean ceremonially in the religious law, as well as unclean physically. Therefore, it causes you to be an outcast as long as you have it. That's verse 46, because that's the only way they had to deal with it. You have to be cut off from everyone else and shut out. And everything to do with it, so your clothes and whatever else and all that stuff has to be burnt. That's the only thing they can do with the clothes. That's verses 52 to 57 describe how that goes about. So it's the only way to get rid of it. So aren't you glad, thankful to God that He's enabled us to develop treatment for that these days? No one needs to go to the stage that this guy was at. But in those days it was pretty much a death sentence, a painful and isolated and long death. And it's isolated because you couldn't see your family, you couldn't mix with people, you could only hang around with other lepers. Anytime you went in anywhere, you had to ring a little bell and yell unclean, unclean. So you had the stigma as well. Now, just looking at that list we just went through, I don't know what you thought when you went through it, but did anyone realise how leprosy is a lot like sin? You know, if you've got the little sheet in front of you, you've probably seen that already, but let's just look at why many see that this is this disease, leprosy, is a model or a symbol of sin. If you look at that list, let's go. It goes deep into your heart, so beyond the skin. It's very contagious, so it spreads like a disease, doesn't it? Sin does. Because very often one person's sin encourages others to sin, and it just spreads, certainly through a people, and through a church even, or whatever. It defiles you, so it makes you unclean and unable to have a relationship with God, and that's really the central issue here. You're separated from God. That's what sin does. And because you're unclean and separated, therefore you are permanently separate from Him unless something is done. So it's not just a temporary separation. Sin is permanent separation. And also sin's destiny is destruction through fire. So if you're contaminated, obviously you have it. You have to end up in there as well, in that fire as well. So you can see there's a direct correlation between all those things. So that's why leprosy is a very clear type or symbol of sin in a person. Okay, so this is the building blocks as we go through. So I hope you can hold that one in. Now, with laws so strict, and for good reason, this man who came to Jesus was being very brave. Because, he's an outcast, he's not supposed to be mixing with people. And he was breaking the law even by being out in public in this way, mixing like this. But his desperation made him seek Jesus. But was it just his desperation? Because he says to Jesus, "If you will, you can make me clean." So you can read into that quite clearly that he wasn't doubting Jesus' ability to heal him, was he? He just wasn't sure of Jesus' desire, whether he wanted to heal him. So I would say that, yes, he was desperate, but more deeply, he believed Jesus was who he said he was. So he had faith. So he knew he could heal him. It was just a question of, would he want to? So what did Jesus say? He said, "I will. I want to. So be clean." And then he also touched him. And that in itself would have shocked a lot of people watching on that day. But I would argue that at the moment of contact, Jesus would have been dealing with a cleansed man, a healthy leprosy-free believer. Some people would say, if you touch, obviously the law is there. If you touch a leper, you're ceremonially unclean, and Jesus couldn't do that. But I believe he healed him just at the moment of just before he touched him. So had he not been healed of his physical disease, he'd not only been healed of his physical disease, but he'd also been healed of his spiritual disease, and that was sin. So by faith, this man had been born again, or more precisely in the Greek, born from above. So that's the phrase that Jesus used with Nicodemus in John 3 a couple of times. So born from above. So that's another one you need to keep hold of as we go through this morning. He'd now been spiritually conceived as a new creation from God. So like I said, keep that in your memory banks, and we'll look at that later. But then Jesus tells the man to go and show himself to the priests. He did this because he knew the law of Moses. This is what Moses' law required, that when you healed from leprosy, which there weren't very many, but when you had to go and present yourself to the priests. Now, from the high priest perspective, probably we only read of a couple of people in the Bible, and they're way back. Naaman was one, and Naaman Syrian, and even back to Miriam. They're the only ones in the Bible known to have been healed from leprosy. So I don't think it was very common. So I imagine the priest would have had to sort of get that scroll off the shelf, blow the dust off a bit, and what are we doing in this situation? So, Jesus was doing something pretty unheard of for this time in history. But he still told him not to tell anyone else. And he often did that, didn't he? He said, don't tell anyone. And that's presumably to make sure that things proceeded towards his crucifixion at the Father's timing and no one else's timing. But still, there would probably have been some onlookers at this healing, no doubt. So that's why we read in verse 15, "Now even more, the report about him went abroad, and great crowds gathered to hear him and be healed of their infirmities." But note this, he would withdraw to desolate places and pray. So we saw earlier in Luke, if you recall back, if you're here, that the crowds were kind of chasing him around a bit. And this particular event now just boosted their zeal even more, obviously. But Jesus wasn't seeking popularity. He wasn't trying to capitalise on the momentum that he had, like a promoter might suggest. You've got to make the most of this opportunity, get famous. But he was more concerned with following the Father's timing and preparing himself for the next part of his ministry. So there's a challenge for us, isn't it? Do we do that? So are we more concerned with appearances and pleasing people and getting well known, or are we more concerned with substance and pleasing God? That's a bit easier for us in a church this size, isn't it? It's a bit just, we can concern ourselves with substance and pleasing God. But there's always the temptation. So another way of saying it, do we spend our time focusing on taking opportunities for material wealth more than spiritual wealth? Now, a good and positive example is a guy called Irenaeus. Now, he was from Egypt back in the 400s AD. The story goes that he had determined to live a holy life, so that meant a bit of a monk kind of guy out in the desert. So he abandoned the conforms of Egyptian society to follow an austere lifestyle out there in the desert. Yet whenever he visited the great city of Alexandria, he spent time wandering through its bazaars, that's the markets. Asked why, he explained that his heart rejoiced at the sight of all the things he didn't need. It's an interesting way of looking at it. You have to have good self-control, I think. Maybe he just didn't have any money too, but his heart rejoiced at all the things he didn't need. So I'm not saying we all need to go and be hermits, of course, but I'm challenging us all about whether we could ever reach the kind of maturity to view material things in that way and sort of celebrate that we don't need something. Jesus certainly did. To him, fame and popularity and self-indulgence were no attraction. But time with his Father was. And so that's what we see him do in verse 16 there. So in fact, there's an American pastor, Dave Guzik, and he was actually in Perth last month. Unfortunately, I didn't get to see him, but he notes this important point. The demands of life push Jesus to prayer, not from it. So the demands of life push Jesus towards prayer, not away from it, like many of us, demands of life takes us away from prayer, doesn't it? So there's another plug for our prayer meeting this afternoon. Get there and we'll get together. So let's all pray that we can grow in Jesus' likeness too, in the way he prayed. Okay, so despite Jesus' elusiveness, he was really starting to pull the crowds. So naturally the interest of the religious establishment was getting aroused, and so they start to say, who's this guy that everyone's flocking to? Better go and check him out. So they've done this before, and they keep doing it just to keep tabs on him. Now remember, Jesus was up in the north in Galilee up there. So it's hard to see. That's a very light map, isn't it? But Jerusalem must be way down here somewhere. So he's up, actually going to Capernaum for this next part. So in Capernaum, we'll see who's coming along this time, verse 17. On one of those days, as he was teaching, Pharisees and teachers of the law were sitting there. They'd come from every village of Galilee and Judea and from Jerusalem. So Judea and Jerusalem in the south. And the power of the Lord was with him to heal. All right, so we have all the heavies, all coming up to keep an eye on this guy from as far away as Jerusalem. It's about 100 k's, I think, up to the lake of Sea of Galilee there. Now we know Jesus was starting to get attention, of course. Obviously, it's happening when the centre of religious power, Jerusalem, starts sending off people to check him out. And Luke says, the power of the Lord was with him to heal. So verse 18. And behold, some men were bringing on a bed a man who was paralysed, and they were seeking to bring him in and lay him before Jesus. Okay, so you got the scene there. They're just a packed house and they can't get in. They're trying to get Jesus' attention, so they had to get creative. Verse 19, but finding no way to bring him in because of the crowd, they went up on the roof and let him down with his bed through the tiles into the midst before Jesus. Now just to explain, the word tiles there can just mean clay. It's the same word. So when you look at the account of Mark as well, you can sort of piece together that the men sort of dug through the clay roof. The roofs are flat there, so you can dig through and you pull out everything and you have a mixture of thatch and stuff. So I'm sure a lot of it would have dropped down on the people inside the house and made a bit of a mess, but this is important stuff. So that's what they were trying to do. So they pulled it all out and they went and dropped him through. So it would have taken a little while. So you can imagine people were even yelling at them, what are you doing, guys? Damaging property, all that stuff. But this was their faith. They knew they had to get their friend to Jesus. And I'd be fairly sure that the paralytic man himself would have been right behind it too. His faith would have been right there with the faith of his friends. As we can figure that out from verse 20. Because Jesus said, and when he saw their faith, he said, man, your sins are forgiven you. Now, you've probably heard a lot of people get uptight about how Jesus appears to heal the man on the strength of what appeared to be his friend's faith. Have you heard that issue? Some people I'm sure have. It sounds like he's healing on his friend's faith. That's not right. But one obvious thing that no one seems to note, firstly, is that their faith would include the man as well, wouldn't it? I mean, he's one of the them. We always imagine 4 friends because one on each corner and plus him, so let's just assume there's 5 of them, but we don't know. But it's their faith, and he was one of them. And anyway, what we're about to see, Jesus knows people's hearts anyway. So we can conclude from what he said and from his actions that Jesus certainly acknowledged the man's belief in him and certainly included him in the faith that he recognised in the group of men as a whole. But Jesus was also aware of the Pharisees who were there as well, and he wanted to make a point to them. So by declaring the man forgiven. Sure, he was dealing with the main problem first, and that's a legitimate point to make here. But he was also setting the religious guys up. He knew they didn't believe who he was. They didn't believe he was the Son of God, the Messiah. So it was not surprising then when we read in verse 21, and the scribes and the Pharisees began to question, saying, who is this who speaks blasphemies, who can forgive sins but God alone? Now many times the religious guys were wrong in God's eyes, but when it comes to the law of Moses, they were always very clear on the detail in the letter of the law. And here, of course, then they were dead right, weren't they? Only God can forgive sins. But their lack of faith blinded them to the true solution to their worry. They were worried, this guy's blaspheming. It's a bit like someone with an atheist perspective who believes in evolution, I think. So those people, their presupposition is that no God exists, means the true solution to the question of how did we get here, which is that God created us, that's not even on the table as an option to them, because they blind themselves to that as a possibility. Therefore, they're forced to commit themselves to a wrong and frankly ridiculous conclusion that the universe created and designed itself. It's a similar thing here, I think. They presuppose, the Pharisees and that God cannot be man, at least certainly not this man, not Jesus of Nazareth. You know, who's this guy anyway? A nobody from nowhere. Therefore, they come to the wrong conclusion about what they've just seen. And they conclude that Jesus is blaspheming. Now, they're not saying this out loud, they're thinking it. And we can, again, piece that together from the other accounts. But Jesus knows anyway. And now that they have taken the bait, Jesus then goes and tackles them. And it says, when Jesus perceived their thoughts, he answered them, "Why do you question in your hearts?" Which is easier to say, "Your sins are forgiven you," or to say, "Rise and walk." So which is easier? Is it your sins are forgiven or rise and walk? Your sins are forgiven. It's easier to say that because you don't have to show any proof. Okay? But if you say rise and walk and the guy doesn't do it, you kind of have egg on your face, don't you? So that's why it's easier to say your sins are forgiven. But Jesus can say both safely. Because Jesus is God, and God has authority not just forgive sins, but to heal as well. So he goes on. But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. So this is an authority thing. He said to the man who was paralyzed, "I say to you, rise, pick up your bed and go home." So see, this healing was meant to be a pointer to the greater truth of his authority as Messiah. Okay, it's not the healing itself so much. It's who has the authority. So the healing wasn't the end point. The identity of Jesus was the end point. And it's the same now. Are you impressed by Jesus' miracles as we read them? Great, but unless that takes you to a face-to-face relationship with the identity and authority of God himself, you've missed the point. And that's what I'm pretty much always trying to do when I preach, because that's what the Bible is pretty much always trying to do. When you get down to brass tacks, it's about God's revelation of himself to mankind. It's a relational thing. So in fact, John calls them signs. All the miracles of Jesus are signs pointing to himself and to God. And most specifically, God revealed himself in Jesus Christ. So he's the centre of the whole thing. He's what it's all about. So it's probably getting ahead of what I'm trying to say, but let's just finish off the story, shall we? So the man does as Jesus commands. So he gets up, picks up his little bed thingy, and walks back home. And he was now walking with the Lord in more ways than one, I guess you could say. That must have felt so good. Can you imagine? After, I don't know how long he was paralysed, probably a whole life. Would have felt so great to be walking. No wonder he was glorifying God. But it wasn't just him. This might have been indoors, but it was still very public, wasn't it? People were packed in. So everyone else praised God too. Well, everyone except the Pharisees and scribes, I suppose. But can that help you to see why theology matters? Because their theology, the Pharisees and scribes, it didn't allow for some guy with illegitimate parents from Nazareth who didn't follow the rules, their rules, to be the Messiah, let alone God in flesh, because they had a different idea of what the Messiah would be. So because their theology was wrong, they missed realising who he really was. And that had eternal consequences for most of them, unless they repented before they died. But as for the rest, the people there on that day, they were certainly impressed. Though that doesn't necessarily mean they all had saving faith like the paralysed guy did. But Luke tells us their response in verse 26. And amazement seized them all. It's pretty easy to be amazed when you see that. And they glorified God and were filled with awe, saying, "We have seen extraordinary things today." And they sure had, yep. And again, notice where the praise is directed. It's to God, isn't it? So again, I'll point out that that's the point of it. When we recognise God's work in some way, God wants us to get to know him better. So when we grasp his greatness a bit more, or his love and compassion, or his power, or whatever attribute he's showing at the time, the right response is to praise him for it. Because I think a lot of people are quick to blame God when something goes wrong. You probably all think of someone like that. But to be consistent, those people should also praise him when things go right. If you're going to be fair, you got both sides. Which, things are going right. If you're still breathing and you still have food to eat and a home to live in, I think there's an awful lot of time for us to be praising God. And plus everything else on top of that. All right, so we've learned a few lessons along the way as we've looked at these 2 episodes in Jesus' life. Just to quickly recap, we've seen that God is looking for faith to be shown in our lives. So he can see to the faith in our hearts. We've noted also how Jesus wasn't after popularity or worldly gain, and how we should be like that. We should be looking for eternal things. And we saw how the demands of life pushed Jesus to prayer, not away from it. That's another good lesson to learn. And we've also just discussed how everyone responded in praise to God when they saw the miracle. And that's a good example for us to follow. So there's a lot of practical things there we can learn. But there is more here. But it takes a step back to see the bigger picture. And then we ask the question, why are these stories side by side like this? So did they happen one after the other? Maybe, but we can't be sure. But Luke put them there this way. So to unravel this, we need to go back to the point I made earlier about leprosy. Okay. So what was leprosy symbolic of? Can you answer? Sin. Yep. So what would a leper represent then in the symbol? Yeah, mankind, yep. In their natural state. The unregenerate. So an unregenerate person in sin. A non-believer. So that person is infected with sin, right? We'll go with the male, it's easier. He is alienated from God and his people, and he's destined for destruction. That's the natural man in his natural state, okay? So everyone follow that so far? So at this point, I'm going to bring out my trusty 3 phases of salvation diagram. You knew I had to do it at some point again. But it's helpful to tie these things. If I keep using the same diagram, you see how it all fits together consistently. So, for any who aren't familiar with this, basically God saves us in 3 phases. So first, justification. That's the big Christian word, the theologian word, but the idea is our conversion. That's at the bottom there. When we first pass from outside Christ to be in Christ through the cross, and then we're justified. That makes us justified, that first step. And that's an instantaneous thing. And that's true for every genuine believer, so it's in the past. Okay? So that's the tense of it, is past. Then in the second sense, we're saved through sanctification as well. That's the growth in faith, growth with Christ, which is the present phase for the believer. So that's where we learn what it means to walk with Jesus as Lord. And that's also called being saved, because we're being delivered from the power of sin in our lives. Because the Bible says about we are saved and we're being saved and we will be saved. They're all true. So this is being saved, the second phase, sanctification. Thirdly, the third phase of salvation is called glorification. Again, that's the theologian's word. And that's where we have new bodies, and we saw a couple of weeks ago, that we're equipped to receive our inheritance and our reward, and we truly see Christ face to face, see him as he really is. Because at that point we have the physique to handle it. So that's obviously after we die or after we're raptured, so that's still future. Okay. So with that background, just needed to go through that to make sure everyone's on the same page. So how does the healing of the leper fit in? Well, where on the picture does Jesus deal with the unregenerate man trapped in sin? Which one of those 3 phases? Justification, the first one. That's right. So that's the conversion. So that's the healing of the leper. And I think we'll see that the healing of the leper is a great representation of this, because, number one, he was alienated, verse 12, or first part of verse 12 there, as a sinner before God, before Jesus saves him. Number two, he made a confession that he believed Jesus was able to save him, and that's the second part of verse 12. As must the sinner to be justified. It's the same thing. We have to make that confession. Not verse 3, but number 3. Jesus then restored him, both physically and as well as the fact that Jesus touched him, showing that he's now right with God. That's in verse 13. Which is what happens when we confess Christ for the first time. We are now in a right relationship with God. And the fourth point, these are all from the passage that we just read. And then he's told to testify to the rest of God's people when he goes to the priest in verse 14. And then we can obviously expect him to remain in fellowship with God's people, which is what we need to do, isn't it? Once we are born again, born from above, we fellowship with God's people. We go and tell our story of God's grace and remain with God's people for the rest of our lives. So there's those 4 points there just from that little passage that we read, which give us the idea that this is a great picture, the healing of the leper is a great picture of our justification. That's the point of being made right with God and having our sins removed. So I hope you see that. Yep. So do you see where I'm headed with the next episode with the paralytic? But before we get into that, we need to understand that if leprosy represents sin in the first healing, then we need to figure out what the equivalent thing is in this second one with the paralytic guy. So what's wrong with the paralytic? What can't he do? He can't walk. Yep. He's lame. He can't walk. So what does walking represent in the Bible usually? Think about it now. Christian lives? Yeah, spiritual journey. Yeah. So it's often used in the Bible that way. So walking represents our Christian life, our Christian walk. So that's sanctification, isn't it? That's our Christian walk. So this man, at the point when he's before Jesus, represents those who are saved but not walking in faith. Either because they're baby Christians, so they've just got born and they can't walk, that's like a baby. Or because they're presently lazy or a bit rebellious. Now, of course, it's okay to be a baby if you're just born. But it's not okay to be a baby if you've been a Christian for 30 years and you're still a baby, okay? Or you're a bit rebellious, like I say. So, now you might ask for a bit more proof of why I'm saying this. So, okay, let's think back to this, back to the diagram. So go back, sorry, that was just baby or lazy believers. So back to the diagram. Remember how we said someone who was in Christ has been born from above. Well, how did this man get to come before Jesus? He went through the roof, didn't he? So he came down from above. So that's one reason I would argue he represents those who are already Christians, but there are plenty more. And he came there because his friends helped him. That's in verse 18. Isn't this how Christian life should be lived? With our friends? Yeah, with a little help from our friends and all that. Perhaps more biblically, your brothers and sisters in the faith, they help us. So then Jesus deals with the man's sins, verse 20, which is still necessary all through our Christian lives, isn't it? We have them forgiven, but we still need to get them dealt with as we go on through life. So Jesus deals with the man's sins. And Jesus doesn't deal with this sin to get us re-saved, okay, or reborn from above. That's already been done once and for all. But sin does affect the relationship between ourselves and God, so that's why he's got to keep purifying us and washing us daily. So then, this man who can't walk is empowered to walk the way he should by Jesus, verse 24, who of course is the power for our Christian walk, isn't he? So we need to look to him alone if we're going to have strength in our spiritual legs. You can put it that way. But there is more. Not steak knives, but there are more. What did Jesus instruct him to do beyond getting up and walking? There's three things at the end. So you get up, pick up your mat. Yeah? So that sounds like a bit like carrying your own load, doesn't it? Perhaps taking up your yoke. That's Jesus' terminology in Matthew 11, verse 30. So that's part of our Christian walk, is to carry our burdens and hopefully do it with joy, praising God like the man did. Okay, in verse 25 it tells us he was full of joy and he's carrying his load. Okay, so if there's a representation there of justification, conversion, in the healing of the leper, and a representation of sanctification, growth, in the healing of the paralytic, might there be something about glorification there too? Of course there is. Let's look at where Jesus sends the guy who was paralysed. Where did he send him? Home. He didn't send him to the priest like the leper. He just went home to be with his family. He and everyone with him and around him had great joy and glorified God, didn't they? All of them glorified God. Sounds a bit like heaven, don't you think? So, there you go. I think hope I've given it enough evidence to see what I think God is telling us in the bigger picture of these two stories. So yeah, that's about it. I just love how God jam-packs his word with richness and truth. And I don't think you could ever exhaust the depth in the word of God in the Bible. And it's seen in the consistency across all the books of the Bible, all united in one overall aim to glorify Jesus Christ. And one of his greatest glories is how he saves you and me. And that's why we're singing a lot of the salvation type songs today. Because he deals with our sin like the leper, and he brings us into the family. Then he gives us the power to walk with him like the paralytic and carry our burdens in this life. And then he calls us home in the end to glory and joy with himself and with our brothers and sisters. So I think that's great news, don't you? Yeah? Yes? Good. So if you haven't started yet, if you're still a leper, come to Jesus. Make sure you sort that out today if you're not. And if you're a paralytic, if you're saved but not walking right, come to Jesus. Come to him afresh today and he can give you the legs to walk with him again. So then whatever stage each of us is currently at, we all have that amazing and blessed hope of eternity with him face to face with our brothers and sisters. Amen? Amen. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word to us. Thank you for giving us these things in so many different ways for us to understand. Help us to be able to take these things on board and to walk with you in our spiritual lives, Lord, as you deal with our sin, as you lift us up and you say your burden is easy and your yoke is light. And we thank you for that. Life isn't easy, but Lord, in the end, you are with us, you're alongside us, helping us carry it. So please help us to trust you with that. So we thank you for this message to us now in Jesus' name. Amen.